Okay, so yes, welcome everybody to this outreach event organized by the Lake Como School of Advanced Studies. Today is an honor to have Prof. Chris Spade here with us tonight. So just a few words about his very long CV, which had to shorten to a manageable amount. So Chris is an expert in the field of computational social sciences. He studies how artificial intelligence shapes human behavior. He wrote pieces for many prestigious journals and media outlets that you all know, like the New York Times, Harvard Business Review, Nature, Science, you name one, he has an article on it. He did his PhD in Harvard in 2011. He had various positions after that at the University of Michigan and the University of North Carolina. And currently he's a professor of sociology, computer science, political science, and public policy at Duke University. Okay. Thanks a lot. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. I apologize for my poor Italian. I won't even try it because I will only embarrass myself. But I will also apologize in advance for giving a very American talk by an American. Unfortunately, a lot of my evidence today will come from the US, but I'm here today, like so many of the other students at the summer school, because we care about broadening our perspective. So I hope and welcome you to please tell me if these ideas are sort of all too American and what sort of troubles might arise if we try to transport. We are actually, some colleagues and I are trying to transport this work into other areas. But let me begin by telling you a little bit about someone I met in the course of writing my last book. Her name is Sarah Rendon. It's actually not her name, it's a pseudonym that I gave to her to protect her identity. But I was interviewing, qualitatively, hundreds of Americans about their experience of political polarization on social media. And she told me this story which has stuck with me to this day. I simply asked her, tell me about the last time you used social media. And she said, well, I haven't been using social media. In fact, I've stopped for a few weeks. And I said, well, tell me why. And she says, well, I was up late one night, putting my children to bed. She has 2 kids. She was very worried about them. I said, why are you worried about your kids? Well, she said, 2 weeks ago, she was on Twitter, and she was responding to a tweet about gun violence in the United States. As you all know, we have a big problem, very big problem in the United States with gun violence. She, though, is a very conservative woman. Her husband owns a handgun, and she said only something relatively not controversial in the landscape of America's gun debate, which was to say, it's every American's right to own a gun. We may not all agree here, but in America it's a very common view, yeah? She says, within 20 minutes, many, many people began to reply to her tweet, including 2 people who visited her on other social media sites, discovered that she has children, and then posted, we hope your children find your gun and shoot you. I would like to tell you that this is a rare story, but the many, many interviews I did over many weeks are littered with this type of story. And in fact, if we pull back to the broader perspective, this is what our lab, the Polarization Lab, has set out to work on for the last 6 years. We are a team of computer scientists, social scientists, statisticians, political scientists, and social scientists more broadly, and we are both trying to diagnose the key drivers of the type of behavior I just described. Why does it happen? But more importantly, and maybe more urgently, what can we do to address it? And even though we are primarily researchers and we care most about the diagnosis part, today I'll tell the story of the second part of our mission, which is to build tools that help translate our research into real-world settings. So we may start a study with an experiment. So today I'll begin by telling you about an experiment with generative AI. A somewhat ambitious experiment designed to test whether generative AI could be helpful for helping people overcome political differences. Second, I'll tell you about how we prototype these ideas into middleware or tools that you can use in tandem with social media sites in order to implement some of the insights from our research. And finally, and this is rare, I won't say this always happens, but a few times we've been very lucky to influence actual social media companies to try to implement the things that we prototyped with this middleware. Okay. So I began by saying, this terrible story of this very actually thoughtful young woman who was horribly harassed. And I said this is not a rare experience. Here we're only looking at the US, but internationally I think the results are very similar. The most common reason people get harassed on social media is for expressing their political views. It's similar in Italy, I know from talking to Italian friends. It's similar in Germany, I know from talking to German friends. It's really a global problem. So what do we know about what works to reduce these types of tensions? Well, about 5 years ago, I was part of 2 large teams of social scientists, so psychologists, political scientists, sociologists, and others, economists even. And we set out to find all of the interventions that had a strong evidentiary basis. So we've run maybe 2, 3, 4 experiments with thousands of people, and we identify interventions that really seem to work. It's surprising because if you believe, like many people do, that polarization is growing and is widespread, almost inevitable. I suspect many of you feel that way because I used to feel this way until I started doing this research. The good news is there are many things that seem to help. The bad news is they're hard to implement. So I'll give you an example. In the US, we have a lot of what we call grassroots efforts. So here, you could imagine a group of people, let's come back to the gun control example that I was talking about earlier, and let's say we're in a town that has just experienced some kind of gun violence, and you have half of the dinner table that's arranged by an NGO or a non-governmental organization like this. Half of them, they want more gun control, and the other half, let's say, wants less gun control. So there's a bunch of social science experiments where we go out with our clipboards and we measure before and afterwards. We ask people, what do you think of your people who don't think like you? Do you want to have more conversations like this? Or is this just a stressful waste of your time? And interestingly, most of the time, when people engage with someone with whom they disagree politically, they find it less stressful than they thought. They find it very productive. In part because we tend to do what we all know happens, right? When we don't interact with each other, then misperceptions can grow. We misunderstand each other if we don't talk to each other, yeah? So it's very simple intervention. The problems are perhaps obvious. The first is, how many people want to go to dinner with people who they don't agree with? Not many. Or at least a very unusual type of person wants to go to dinner with someone with whom they disagree. Second, for these interventions to be successful, they seem to require a skilled moderator, someone who's trained at implementing conflict de-escalation techniques, yeah? And we have very few of those. And even if we could hire hundreds more, in the US anyways, we'd still be only doing a very small amount of the work that needs to be done at the scale of social media. If you want to prevent the type of harassment that we talked about at the outset, you could not simply have lots of these conversations. You would need to intervene at the level of social media itself. So, can AI, a large language model, facilitate more productive conversations about politics? I suspect everybody here is familiar with generative AI tools like ChatGPT or Anthropic's Claude or Google's Gemini. You probably wouldn't be here if you weren't at least a little interested in this topic, I guess. But we are early in the experiment with LLMs. I think many of us were very impressed when we first saw them. So I'll tell you my story. I was doing some work with Google, which was very interested at the time in determining whether chatbots could be created to counter hate speech online. So if you have maybe people saying anti-immigrant, hateful rhetoric, Could an LLM respond with a message that sort of admonishes that person? And this was 2021, so far before ChatGPT was launched. And even back then, we were seeing signs that the large language models were extremely good at what we all now know they're very good at, impersonating humans, seeming human, yeah? But there's so many challenges, especially in those early days. We immediately became aware, and now we all know this very well, that LLMs can hallucinate. LLMs exhibit bias. LLMs can be unpredictable. We are now, I think many of us are very familiar with LLMs, and we tend to focus primarily on the negatives of LLMs in politics. Perhaps LLMs could create misinformation. Perhaps LLMs could create fake videos. And we've seen this empirically in the real world, so we know that it can happen. But I think the story of social media has taught us that if we only focus on the negative parts of new technologies, we need to focus on them, we should, but we may spend a lot of time trying to dissuade a small group of people from ruining the internet for the rest of us. What if we instead shifted our focus to think about making the greater majority of people a little bit more open, a little bit more humble, a little bit more better at talking across political divides? And so some co-authors and I, in fact, a co-author from the same Summer Institute that many of you are here from today, Lisa Argyle, who's a brilliant young political scientist, she and I began to say, hey, maybe we could do some really cool experiments to test whether an LLM could do the work of those people, the conflict mediators, who sit in a dining room table for hours and help people overcome political differences. Now, first, maybe I shared this idea with Lisa, and she said, yeah, we're crazy. We shouldn't do this. Yeah, it's a really bad idea. We don't know if these things will go off the rails. We don't know if they will harass people. We don't know if they will hallucinate, right? It was early days. It was not 4 years ago now. So we began to try an experiment on a very small scale. And we took those papers that I just showed you where we had identified the landscape of interventions that seemed to work. And one by one, we tried them with an LLM. So, for example, we tried active listening, restating your political opponent's views back to them to demonstrate that they have been heard. So, it's a very common technique, right? The key problem in any kind of argument, really, is demonstrating to someone that you have heard and understood them. There's few things more frustrating than trying to have a conversation without getting understood. I think that's a universal, yeah? So, we humans are very bad at this, right? Anybody who's been in an argument can identify this. We become emotional, we become irrational, all sorts of other competing incentives, right? But an LLM, in fact, can be very patient. It's very good at summarizing things. It's very good at being sort of boring, right? And regurgitating things, yeah? And so we immediately discovered it's actually pretty good at this. If we had two people talking, we could probably prompt the LLM to encourage that person to engage with the other person's statement before they start expressing their view. Second, simply the tone. So we've all now seen how a multimodal model or early models could take a Picasso and turn it into a Van Gogh, yeah? And the style of Van Gogh. But the same things are possible with language. So we can take an angry statement and make it a civil statement. Extremely important to us throughout this intervention was to preserve human autonomy. Because you can imagine a version of this study where we simply took people's words, put them into an LLM to make them maximally persuasive to the other person, sent them to the other person, and crossed our fingers that something good happened. But there are many, many important problems in that kind of study. Number one, would it work? We didn't know. We hadn't done an experiment yet. Number two, if it did work, couldn't it easily be repurposed for bad? Couldn't you easily train a persuasive LLM that could then, do the work of Vladimir Putin in campaigning against Ukraine? Yeah? But more importantly, with any other technological revolution, we think about this question, right? What is the role of humans? What is our role? And so it was very important to us in any intervention that we did that we would not actually change the meaning of people's arguments, only the ways in which they express them. Third, we did not want to force AI on anyone. So the experiment I'm about to describe, we did it very early, in 2022. And back then, nobody knew what ChatGPT was, we think, or maybe one or two, but almost nobody knew because it wasn't really out yet. GPT-2 was out, which was actually pretty good, but GPT-3, which impressed so many people, was not out yet. And we wanted people to feel like they could completely ignore these tools. We don't want to force this on anyone. So we designed an experiment that would allow us to translate people's messages to each other using LLMs in a way that preserved human autonomy, in a way that was optional for people, and in a way that preserved the intentions of humans. So let me show you how that experiment looked. But first, let me say a few more words about the context. So I started with the story of Sarah Rendon, in part because the focus of this first experiment is exactly on gun control. So this is a lovely piece of art by the artist JR that I discovered at the MoMA in Amsterdam. And here you can see clippings from Time magazine, which is, as you probably know, a very popular magazine in the US that covers many different topics. But I show it to you mostly to illustrate the range of different ideas about gun control. You know, we have debates about mental health and gun control. And I know, of course, you do here as well. I know we all heard the news of the horrible disaster in Austria some weeks ago, a young man apparently very mentally troubled. We also have debates about guns in our schools. As crazy as I feel saying that to a civilized nation, yeah, we have debates about whether we should have guns in our school. And many other people have debates about what kinds of weapons we should have, right? Should we have these giant assault weapons, or should we only be allowed to have handguns, right? These are the types of messages that come up in America's gun debate, and many, many more that I can't describe in a short time. So, what did we do? We recruited approximately 2,000 people. We wanted to find half of them who supported gun control measures, they wanted less guns, and half of them who wanted to preserve the right to own guns. And we asked them a bunch of questions, and then we told them when they came into the survey, as part of this survey you will have to have an online chat with somebody else. We didn't tell them the person will disagree with them or what the chat would be about. We simply said you're going to have a chat. And so you can see this is an idealized version of our experiment. This is not real data. This is just a description. So here we have a Democrat. And Democrats are typically pro-gun control, but not exclusively. And so if someone was a Democrat who had an anti-gun control measure, they would be on our anti-gun control side. But let's just say, for this example, that a Democrat says something like, guns are a stain on democracy. And then the person who they've been matched with is maybe sort of like Sarah Rendon's husband, right? Believes strongly that it's every American's right to own a gun and that this is a sort of essential ingredient to protecting democracy, yeah? And then we all know where this type of conversation goes. It goes nowhere good. The typical conversation might include the pro-gun control person saying something like, you are very naive, right? And then it becomes ad hominem, and then it becomes name-calling, and then it becomes unproductive. So, in our experiment, half of the people just have a chat, no LLM, nothing else, but half of them, after they exchange 3 messages, they begin to receive a pop-up before their message goes to their partner. And the pop-up says, you have the option, instead of sending your original message, to send this other message that has been restated by GPT-3. Again, it was an early language model. And we prompted the LLM, we didn't tell the people this is what we did though. We prompted the LLM to read the conversation, read the message that the person was about to send, read a description of the academic research about how to de-escalate tense conversations, and offer one of 3 different rephrasings. So they could either be encouraged to restate their conversation partner's argument back to them. They could be encouraged to restate their message in a more civil way. Or they could be encouraged to validate the right of the other person to disagree with them, which is a third evidence-based strategy that has a strong basis in the scientific literature. So they could completely ignore this and say, no, I want to send my original message. They could agree to send one of these rephrased messages, option 2, or they could rewrite their original message after having seen the rephrased message. To our surprise, about 70% of people chose to send the rephrased message. So, what we are hoping that will happen is on the right side, if this Democrat, instead of saying something like, "You are incredibly naive," instead restates the person's perspective. "I understand that you value guns, but," and then delivers a more nuanced version of their message. We hope that the conversation takes a better turn, and they at least become mutually aware of their differences, and perhaps they can even have a productive conversation about them. And so when I show you the results for this, we will be trying to figure out whether the person who is assisted by the LLM, whether their partner has a better view of them, has a better view of the conversation, and wants more conversations like that. So in these conversations, only one person is being assisted by the LLM, and we're trying to determine whether the person that they're talking to has a more positive, productive experience of the conversation. So, here's for the social scientists in the crowd. I'll go quickly if we have questions or if people want to ask about the details of the study, we can come back. But I'll say, to sum it up briefly, political scientists have come up with many ways to measure the quality of a conversation. Actually, a lot of the best work begins in Europe in this topic, going all the way back to Jürgen Habermas and so many other social theorists. We care a lot about the quality of discourse. And so we can ask people a bunch of questions like, did you feel respected by your partner? Did you feel understood by your conversation partner? Were you able to communicate your values? And we can create a single measure by aggregating across all of these questions. And we compare the people who had their partner who had the LLM versus people who had no LLM. So it's an experiment. One half has no LLM, and in the treatment condition, one person has the LLM, and we want the other person to rate the conversation as higher quality if our theories are right. Second, democratic reciprocity. A bit of jargon, again from political science, but the key idea is that you want more of the engagement across political difference. So, we would love for the conversation to go well, but even if the conversation doesn't go well, we would like people to want to keep trying. Because most people, as I said at the outset, they don't want to engage with people who are different than them. They want to live in an ideological silo. Yeah? It's a sort of a human tendency, we think, depending on which research you read. So this is a series of questions about things like, do you find it difficult to see the point of view of someone different than you? Or even if you don't agree with them, do you see value in engaging with them? Yeah? Democratic reciprocity. So our first two hypotheses were that the person whose partner was being assisted by the LLM, if that person chose the rephrased messages, they should have higher conversation quality ratings, and they should want more democratic reciprocity. They should have higher democratic reciprocity. They should want more conversations across political divides. Lastly, we also measured what they thought about guns themselves. Did they, after the conversation, after the experiment, did they want to have more or less gun control, essentially? And we asked them all sorts of different things about these different kind of cases. So do you prefer laws that prevent people from carrying a concealed weapon? Do you prefer laws that insist upon everyone having a background check before they buy a gun? Because as you may know in the US, you can in many cases buy a gun without a background check. Now this one, we hoped that the model did not work, because to return to something earlier that I said, building a persuasive AI is actually something that is troubling, yeah? If you think about it being repurposed for bad actors, or if you even ask the question, should the people who build the technology have superior capacity to change people's minds on any issue, right? That's a disturbing precedent. So we hoped that this hypothesis would be null. We hoped that people would not exhibit changes in their political attitudes. We only wanted them to have a better conversation and to want more conversations. And we say it's up to the people to change their mind. It's up to them to, maybe this conversation can open up it can liberate them cognitively enough that they can accept a broader range of evidence, and maybe when they read the next media article about gun control, they'll be a little more receptive. And then maybe months down the road, they will behave differently or think differently. Okay. So those are our 3 hypotheses. But it's not that easy. So, again, just for the social scientists in the room, if you have 2 people, you try to get them on the same call at the same time, right? Well, one person, their favorite TV show comes on, so they leave. And then the other person, their kid needs to go to bed, so they leave, right? And even if you get thousands of people and try to have them talk at the same time, you know, someone starts using TikTok, they take off. You know, someone else's phone dies, they take off, right? It's really, really hard to get the 2,600 people we started with to actually finish the survey. Now, a small point about causality. If certain types of people leave your study because of the nature of your study, that's bad. So for example, imagine you have been invited to my study, to our study, and you say, oh, now I have to have a conversation with someone who I don't agree with. I'm gonna go use TikTok, right? There's no way I'm sticking around. Or maybe you begin to have the conversation and all of a sudden the AI pop-up begins to disturb you and you say, oh, I don't want someone else rephrasing my message, I wanna leave, right? And so if at the end of the study you are only left with the type of people who are willing, maybe they have positive views of AI, or they have positive views of the other party, or they're predisposed to change their mind, and then we find strong effects, then we might say, you know, aha, our work is done, but all we've done is put the very small population of people together who are already predisposed to respond to our intervention. So we do a lot of statistical wizardry to look at this, and basically we find that people leave the study for random reasons. So we don't see any evidence that a certain type of person is staying in the study. That's good. But even still, if one person leaves the study, or if we lose the ability to calculate the effect of the experiment. So what I'll show you next is the effect of the experiment, but we will be estimated in many different ways. The graphs are going to be a little confusing, so I'll walk you through them. But the important thing to know is that we're going to measure not only whether someone who used the LLM, who was offered the LLM, used it, but how many times they used it. Because we think that the more you use it, the more that your partner should respond positively. Yeah? So, that's the first concern. The second concern, how can we know that GPT-3 was really doing what we thought it would do? I think we've all had the experience of a large language model going off the rails, right? Has anybody made pizza with glue? No? Have you heard about this? This was one of the first hallucinations of Google providing pizza recipes with glue. Don't worry, no pineapple. Just glue. So here, what we did, we wanted to take an analysis of all the messages. So now we're looking at all the back and forth of people who were discussing these, thousands of people. And what we've done here is we prompted GPT-4, later, a better, we think, language model, to read through all those conversations and assign a label to each conversation. So the different colors you're seeing up here, these are the different topics that appeared in the conversation. So some people were talking about mental health, some people were talking about gun control laws, some people were talking about personal experiences, like maybe a loved one who had taken their life because of a gun and suicide, or all sorts of other things. And what we wanted to see is that the LLM was used equally through different topics. Because if they only used it for one topic, then perhaps we were only picking up a very small part of the landscape. And perhaps that would mask the effect of our experiment. So here, you will probably struggle to read in the back, so I'll just summarize to say that it doesn't look like the messages that were rephrased, which are here, were different than the messages before they were rephrased. So it seems like people use the LLM on all sorts of different topics, everywhere. And actually, this is consistent with the emerging evidence on how we know people use LLMs. There's very little research on this so far, but the early signal is that people are using them for all sorts of different things. Yeah? If we each went around and named the last 3 things we did, we'd probably have a crazy list, right? Okay. And second, we wanted to make sure by topic that there was no major differences. And except for one topic, which is stricter background checks where people seem to use the treated message maybe a little bit more. It seems like overall people used it equally. So that was good. But what about the actual language, how they were rephrased? So one of our interventions, for example, takes a message and makes it more civil, makes it more productive. Yeah? And so we use other types of automated tools to detect whether people, for example, express more positive emotion, whether they acknowledge their partner's positions, using some tools from the field of natural language processing. And again, GPT-3 seems to have done its job. So we think it did its job. Now we feel confident we can estimate the effect of the experiment. Okay, on the left, we have the results for conversational quality. On the right, we have the results for democratic reciprocity, which again is whether someone feels excited or willing, I should say, to have more conversations across political divides. There are three different lines. The first gray one is the control condition. So those are the people who had no LLMs. The second yellow line is the person who was assisted by the LLM. And the blue line is, we think, the most important. That is the effect of the intervention on the person's partner. So if my friend Nico and I are having an online conversation and he is being assisted by an LLM, I don't know. I should have mentioned that earlier. We didn't tell anybody that their partner has LLM. But I should have a better judgment of the conversational quality, and I should want more conversations with Nico. But really, who wouldn't want more conversations with my friend Nico? That's wonderful. Okay, so what we need to compare then is the gray line, the control condition, to the blue line, the effect of the experiment on the treated person's conversation partner. It's a mouthful, yeah? So these little stars and the increased positive, here we have the number of times the rephrasing is used. So in this case, we are only estimating people who were assigned to the treatment condition, independent of whether they used it. Now they've used it 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, and 4 times. And as you can see, it seems that the more that people used the rephrasings, the more their partner thought the conversation was high quality, less stressful. They felt more respected, and so on and so forth. All the things our first hypothesis predicted. That was exciting. Second, the same thing, roughly, for democratic reciprocity. So the more that people's partner used the LLM rephrasings, the more they wanted to have more of these conversations. Our second hypothesis, we think, had some support based on these findings. Okay, lastly, what about what people actually think about gun control? This was the one we were worried about. This one, the takeaway message is it doesn't seem to have an effect on people's attitudes about guns. I'm aware of recent studies that suggest LLMs are actually, in fact, very capable of persuasion. So I think maybe these results are messy. But I want to point you to one interesting artifact in the data, which is not the effect on the person's partner, the person getting the LLM assistant, but the person getting the LLM treatment. So I began this debate with Nicolo. I've never won a debate with Nicolo, but if I had an LLM, maybe I'd have a shot, right? So we begin to talk, right? And he's a very convincing anti-gun control, and I'm very pro-gun control, right? After the conversation, I had been hoping to change his view. But when the LLM asked me to read his view, I actually changed my view a little bit. If you look at some of these findings, this yellow line. Now, it's not statistically significant, but there are now 3 studies that suggest when people use LLM to try to persuade others, they wind up persuading themselves. Really fascinating finding that I think many of us are intrigued by. Okay. What are the problems? There are so many problems. To our knowledge, this was one of the first experiments where we had humans interact and put an LLM between them. It was just one kind of intervention. I warned you the talk was mostly about America. It was only about America, right? What if America is unusual? It almost certainly is. It was at one point in time, very early in the story of large language models, right? People had not yet developed attitudes about AI. Now I suspect if we did the experiment exactly the same, you'd have a certain number of people who might be antagonistic or uncomfortable with being assisted by AI, or some people who are very excited about being assisted by AI. The interventions all presume a group of people who are at least willing to have a conversation with a stranger on the internet. That's not everybody. That's a smaller group of people. And lastly, what about downstream effects? So this was one experiment. What about months down the road? What about years down the road? What if we did this every week? Would it look different? We didn't know. Okay. So typically, in most of our experiments, this is where the story ends. And we say, okay, well, we found some interesting things, but we can't convince Facebook or Google or TikTok or whoever to listen. But I was still thinking about Sarah Rendon and people like her, because our intervention had done practically nothing for her, right? We had some proof of concept that this technology could perhaps be leveraged to intervene at the scale of social media. That was our guiding idea. But we hadn't done anything to help. So, this is where we hoped that our experimental research, if we could prototype it into some kind of middleware, would inspire a social media company to try our intervention. And so we were very excited when I was presenting this research, and someone in the audience came up to me afterwards and she said, oh, hey, I'm from Nextdoor. You have Nextdoor in Italy or no? No, okay. Nextdoor is a site that allows you to discuss with your neighbors. So everyone in this area of Como, and you might be talking about things like trash collection, or what do you talk about in Como? I don't know. Yeah, how beautiful, how terrible the weather is all the time, probably, right? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, so that's my best guess. Okay, so I would have thought that a social media platform that is meant to connect neighbors to each other would be pretty friendly, pretty happy, people would be productive, they would invite each other to dinner, but no. If we ask Americans, have you personally witnessed or experienced something that affected you negatively on different social media platforms? Nextdoor was the worst. Incredible, right? Worse than Facebook, worse than Twitter? Oh, that's pretty bad, right? That's pretty bad. Reddit, TikTok. Okay, so I'm making a bit of fun of Nextdoor, but I came to appreciate their CEO, who's now the CTO of OpenAI, who's also a former member of the Northern Ireland government. And so she has a long-term interest in conflict de-escalation. And we connected when I was visiting Stanford, and she said, well, we really need to do something. We're open to experimentation. We were still cautious. We were worried that rolling this out into a large population like an entire social media platform, it could go very wrong, because we were still learning what the technology could and could not do. But we decided to design an experiment. Now I'll walk you through the experiment. Mick Jagger, this delightful little fellow here, has been found. Thanks for all of your help in locating him. So Americans were obsessed with our dogs. You have great dogs here too, but we are truly obsessed with our dogs. It's a big deal if a dog runs away and someone finds their dog. Yep. Okay. So Vanessa is very happy that her dog has been found, and she's thanking the neighbor. Now one of her neighbors is about to write, the owner is a horrible person who shouldn't be able to own a dog if they can't get a hold of it. They should be reported and arrested for animal abuse. I told you it was bad. Okay. If Nextdoor's toxicity measurement technique, which essentially looks at common terms that are used in toxic social media conversations, if it finds a toxic message that is about to send, it randomly, for 1 year, sent them this message. Kind replies make a difference. Your reply looks like something that's been reported for violating our guidelines. Do you want to rephrase it? So, just like our study, they can say, don't rephrase. I'm really mad about this dog. Mick Jagger, be damned. I need to express my opinion. Or I can hit edit comment, and an LLM has drafted this type of response. It's concerning to me to see a dog wandering around without its owner in sight. It's important for pet owners to be responsible. Yeah, not changing the meaning of the message. This person is still upset in communicating their anger, but the style in which it's translated. Yeah, and so then we hope that the user then, Andy Williams, not his real name, that he is inspired to send this message, yeah? So, few things are very different than our study. Number one, this was done throughout an entire year, all over Nextdoor. And even though I've now learned it's not in Italy, it's in many other parts of Europe, it's in many other parts of South America, it has hundreds of millions of users. They're not just talking about gun control, they're not just in the United States, they're talking about everything. They're talking about dogs, they're talking about masks and COVID, they're talking about schools, everything, number one. Number two, they're intervening in already toxic conversations. So many of our conversations begin kind of amicably. You know, what's your name? What do you do? You know, how did you develop your attitudes about gun control, right? That's a pretty amicable way. Here, people were saying they should get arrested, yeah? So there's a much higher bar. Can the LLM help in an already toxic situation in many different cases, yeah? And third, we're now well into the public awareness of ChatGPT. So we're now well into 2023 when this experiment was run with over 600,000 people. And so we know if people are starting to get these pop-ups, like how many of you have seen these pop-ups somewhere on a platform? I don't know, show of hands. Only two. Okay. The rest of you aren't in the experiment, I guess. No, but they're actually common, right? Facebook does things like this. Reddit does some things like this. Many other professional sites have begun to do things like this. The hope was, of course, that this would work even though people have changing attitudes about AI. Some good, some bad. So, in its February 2024 transparency report, Nextdoor, again, I think amicably, because in the landscape of social media companies, most of them are, either not doing research, not sharing data, or sharing data in very complicated and perhaps problematic ways. They put the data, or not the whole data set, I wish they put the whole data set out, but they put the findings from the study out there. And we were very excited when we learned that this intervention had reduced the creation of content that violated their community guidelines by 15%. So if we extrapolate to the hundreds of millions of people who use Nextdoor, this could be hundreds of thousands of conversations that were improved through one experience, right? You didn't get pinged every single time. The old folks will remember Clippy. Do you remember Clippy, the Microsoft paperclip? It was the worst, right? You started typing, it's like, hey, are you typing? Yes, I'm typing, like, leave me alone, So this was not that, it was just one time. It was just intervene and then go away, right? So number one, it seems to have had an effect, but probably also a multiplier effect, yeah? The hope was that kindness begets kindness. We think we know. Maybe we don't know it as well as we could. We think that toxicity begets toxicity. But we have some evidence in our lab that civility begets civility. So how do we move from that toxic, spiral to a productive, civil spiral? We think perhaps this is one of the first ways we might do that. Now I'm running out of time, so I will wrap up only by sharing some new ideas about how we can take this kind of research even farther. As you can tell, I'm kind of an optimist. So you'll tell me all the reasons why I'm wrong after I finish, I hope. But how can we scale this beyond this one kind of intervention? Can LLMs go even farther? Can they actually create a new way of doing research? And in a recent article, this is my argument, essentially, is that it's possible that LLMs will fundamentally begin to reshape the way we do social science. They will create many new opportunities, but they will also create many new problems. And so this article tries to strike a balance, maybe comes a little bit on the optimist side, my good friends tell me. But certainly we're aware of the downsides. Again, bias. Replicating our studies is more difficult. Hallucinations are still a problem. right? New ethical issues, right? Are we obligated always to tell people that we're using AI? I think yes, but researchers are still debating this, yeah? What if we could do wonderful, meaningful science and with minimal harm? Should we be doing that kind of science? Right? All sorts of fascinating new debates exist, but also new ways to do research. So in the last few minutes here, I'll take you through a new platform that our lab, the Duke Polarization Lab, has been building now for 5 years, which we call, perhaps with a little bit of hyperbole, CERN for social science. So could we create an environment? Because social science, you could say, my dear friend Duncan Watts likes to say, social science has finally found its telescope. Yeah? Again, he's an optimist. He may be a little bit of an optimist too, yeah? But the idea is that, we were once data poor. We once lacked the infrastructure to do large-scale experimentation, and many of the people here at this institute, if you've heard other talks in this, you'll hear many of these types of talks, many people experimenting with LLMs. But what if we built a platform where researchers could actually control the whole life cycle of a social media platform? So what if the researcher could create what is on the social media platform? Does it have a like button? Does it not? Does it have comments? Does it not? What type of algorithm do we use to determine the order of information in which things will appear in someone's newsfeed? Also, we can collect, with the consent of research subjects, all sorts of new behavioral data. One of the biggest challenges for us researchers is we want to look at when people's eyeballs pass over something. But very rarely do social media platforms give us this data for good reason, because it's private, right? There are privacy laws. GPDR, where are the Germans? Thank you for GPDR. We collect behavioral and survey data with new scale. Third, we can run experiments. Again, with consent of people. And maybe, just maybe, we can begin to develop an evidence-based social media if we put all these things together, and we can then go to the social media companies and say, hey, we built a different kind of social media. So in some of our experiments, for example, instead of giving people status for being popular, we might try to give them status for being open-minded. Or we may do an experiment with the prompt. When you start a social media platform session, right, it's like, what's going on right now, right? Or you could say something like, what are you curious about? What do you want to learn about? How would that simple nudge change people's behavior? These are the types of things that we can do in this paradigm. We tell people they're helping to test a new social media platform. So our platform is called Spark Social, but Spark Social is actually a ruse. There is no Spark Social. We tell them Spark Social is a company that helps new social media platforms test their products. So when we recruit people to join our study, they think they're testing a new social media platform. We later tell them that they're not. But this allows us to get the kind of external validity we think of like a startup. Yeah, that like, oh, this is a new kind of platform that you should try. And so we might have them use it for 10, 15, 20 minutes. And we could experiment with all these different features or content or combinations of content and features to try to, again, unlock what would make social media better. The big thought experiment here is, if we could, travel back in time and whisper in Mark Zuckerberg's ear, or that maybe not Mark Zuckerberg, I don't know. Okay, Zuckerberg, let's say Zuckerberg, okay. What should we tell him to build, knowing what we know now, right? Nobody's asking this question, we're accepting this current paradigm, right? We have to have a certain kind of newsfeed. We have to have certain kinds of stats. It's just accepted that we're all kind of, maybe we don't like it, but nobody is innovating. Right? And innovating is hard and risky and challenging. So what if we can put some of that burden on us researchers, and we can surface some promising ideas and work with a company like OpenAI, who may or may not be building a social media platform right now, right? If you read the media, that could be really cool. So that's the kind of work we're hoping to do. But even cooler, we can involve the LLMs in the research project. So instead of only interacting with humans, and we do this in some of our studies, we recruit people, like in the experiment I showed today, where people are talking to each other, but we can also prompt LLMs to resemble people. Again, we later tell people that they're going to interact with AI, we later debrief them to tell them that they've interacted with an AI, but this allows us to create not just a dyadic interaction, but to run, we think, experiments on whole groups of people, which for social scientists is kind of our holy grail, right? Most of our theories are about group behavior. And yet it's really hard to convince a group of people to behave one way and observe the effect on another person. But a group of LLMs are very steerable, right? We can make them all civil. So we have one study, for example, that we just posted online, where we had LLMs be a little more civil or a little less civil, and we can immediately detect the effect of the whole platform being a little more civil or uncivil. Interestingly, what we find there is if most people are uncivil, people don't like it, they don't like posting, but they post more. And when they post more toxic content. So simple nudges, right, one direction or the other, can not only unlock new opportunities for innovation, but also new understanding of the mechanisms. Nobody wants to be angry on social media. This is my optimistic take on this paper, right? They feel obligated to defend their side, yeah? And so can we break that cycle by changing the form factor of social media? And lastly, we can do these human-to-human studies, we can do these human-to-AI studies, but increasingly many of the people at this institute and myself are interested in AI-to-AI research. So now we begin to imagine, we've done this, we're doing this, we're starting to do this. Each has its trade-offs, right? The AI can be very bad at impersonating certain types of people. We haven't worked out all those issues. Human-to-AI, there's all these ethical issues. But now imagine if we can run hundreds of experiments on synthetic samples with small large language models that, for example, have a small carbon footprint, something I haven't talked about, but a big problem for all of us to consider. And then learn something, and then prototype it here, and test it in a more artificial setting before we expose humans to these kinds of experiments. Could we perhaps, shortcut science? Could we walk down many doors? Could we open them systematically? Could we have LLMs start to do this with us? Don't replace us, right? This is the scary thing for the social scientists here. They're not going to replace us. This is a theme. I think you hear people like Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, claiming that half of all jobs are going to be gone in 3 years. I think it's ridiculous, right? It's clear that the really clever people will be learning how to work with AI, to learn how to augment what we already do better. Yes, and study how it will create inequality. It will, I think. How it will create new kinds of misinformation. It already is. But some of us need to be putting our eggs in the basket of positive pro-social outcomes, and that's what I hope I've convinced you we may be able to do if we take this research forward. So thank you so much for coming. It's been such a pleasure to meet you all and to be here. I really look forward to talking to you more about our work. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. This was a very fascinating and entertaining talk.
Thank you.
So we'll take a few questions now. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand and I will. All right, you want to go.
Thank you, Chris, for a very interesting talk. Could you go back to your slide on your experiment?
Which part?
The part on the increasing conversation quality as a function of the number of rephrasings.
Yes, yeah. Sorry. The results. Yeah.
Perfect, thanks.
Yeah.
So in the first one, so what is going on with the control?
So this simply shows that the more people talk, the better the conversation quality is rated. Yeah. And so there is an effect in, yes, so longer conversations tend to be rated as higher quality. Yeah.
But that doesn't have an effect on the democratic reciprocity, right?
Yeah, perhaps less. With the willful eye, maybe a little bit, but yeah, less. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. And I don't have a great explanation for why it would exist here and not there.
Yeah.
Just what the data told us. So. Yeah, good question, though. Yeah. I wondered the same thing when I first saw it.
Same question.
Yeah.
More questions?
Thank you, Chris, for a great talk. I was wondering, right, of course, I think over the last X number of years, we know that polarization has been increasing. I guess to what extent do you think that social media could, not just be less polarizing, but actually depolarize, about political discourse? Do you think that answer lies within social media, or is there more to the way that we interact with each other in our lives?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I wrote a whole book about this topic, so I have to be brief because I can go deep. I can go way too deep, believe me. But I think you're asking the right question. Technology is easy to blame. I was sort of, poking fun at Mark Zuckerberg, but, some of the people here have worked for a company like Meta, right? I do not believe, and I think many of the other people who have worked at these companies don't believe that Mark Zuckerberg has this magical dial that he turns up and down to make society polarized or not, If he did, it would be great, right? We could go all tell him, please turn down the dial, right? And now, it's complicated, right? I do think, and the evidence is very, very difficult to navigate. We have now many experiments in many different contexts. But I think most experts would agree that social media is not the only part of the problem. And many experts would even still dispute that social media is the problem. There's a really interesting debate that I got involved with the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who is well known for popularizing the argument that social media is very bad for adolescents, and particularly adolescent girls. He's written a book about this recently. When my book came out, he very kindly agreed to do a sort of Q&A with me, or do the author meets critic. And my book tried to make a very nuanced view, right? It tried to say, yes, social media companies may be partly to blame, but we also have a very strong supply of angry, polarized people. And perhaps it's the case that social media has only amplified an already angry group of people. And if we don't understand why people are angry, then we're not going to make people less polarized, right? So it's a twin process in my view, yeah? So John has a very different view. He thinks it's really, really social media's fault. And so for a long time, we went back and forth. We discussed this, had a lot of nice conversations. And then he said, all right, let's do an analysis together. Let's do a meta-analysis where you grab every study you can that studies this topic, and then you try to do a stock taking at the end of this exercise. So you can go read this Google Doc. It's linked on my CV. It's now been read a crazy number of times. It turns out a lot of people wanted to know the answer to this question we learned. But at the end of the exercise, John says, aha, this Google Doc proves my view. And at the end of the exercise, I say, aha, this Google document proves my view, right? And so I can only say to all of you to go read the Google Doc, because the really interesting thing is we invited many other experts, many with much more experience studying the topic than the two of us combined, to weigh in with their insights. And so in the margins of the Google Doc, it's gotten a little crazy. You can see this debate unfolding. So I think it is more than just social media, quite clearly. And if we need to fix polarization more broadly, social media will be part of the solution, but not the only part. Inequality, all these other drivers of what's making people angry need to be acknowledged and analyzed more clearly as well.
So I come from within different fields, so I just have curiosity.
Yeah.
Sometimes I use AI, for instance, I correct my colleagues and they accept because they are not replying and say, this is not replying to this properly, and AI works perfectly. So now it doesn't change, that means that my email works.
Yes.
Right? But it doesn't change my perception.
Yeah.
So in other words, how that translates here? How can you be sure you're not diffusing the emotional charge you have while using the social media platform without changing the core beliefs?
Core beliefs, yeah.
So also in the video games, if you all shoot, you have extra shoot, but we have the gun to stop shoot. But it doesn't mean that we like to shoot.
I see. So maybe some people engage in social media battles simply for the thrill of it.
That's fine.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Trolls, yeah, for sure.
Without being professional trolls.
Yes, yeah. I think it's a really good point, right? And of course, LLMs in the wrong hands could be very, very concerning, right? Because we already know that LLMs have some persuasive capacity, that they tend to perform better in, for example, inspiring people to consider taking a vaccine for COVID, for example. But one of the reasons they may be particularly persuasive, and here the research is still coming out, so I don't think we know anything definitive yet, they can also tailor the message to a particular person in a particular social context, yeah? So we built a bot, or maybe the Russian Internet Research Agency, it used to have to hire people who kind of clumsily maybe produced 100 messages a day, and they just didn't, we did a study, some other groups did a study, it seems like they didn't have as much impact as you might think. But now, if they are automated, And in theory, there could be thousands of them, depending on how good the social media platforms are at stopping the bots. And they can tailor the message directly to people, yeah? There it's a much scarier situation because the trolls now can, clone themselves, basically, right? So how do we, this is getting very Star Wars, Clone Wars, yeah, I don't know, maybe. But anyways, so we're now doing battle with clones of thousands of trolls, right? This is the reason why I think we can't continue to think of fixing social media as dissuading bad actors only. I've been studying this maybe 15, 20 years now, and I see many people focused on just trying to stop the spread of misinformation, trying to dissuade people from being hateful, right? We know some things work. Putting fact labels on misinformation, that probably helps, some interventions where you counter people. It seems to help a little bit, yeah? But it's like tiny effects and they're ephemeral, they go away, and these people seem to still be trolls a week later, yeah? So if we're only trying to, whack out the trolls, right? We're going to be playing a losing game. So we need to also think about how do we change the structure of a social media platform to make it a less exciting place for trolls to play. And so, for example, I'll give you one example from this book I was mentioning earlier. So, right now, the way that we optimize the order in which information appears in your newsfeed, we don't know exactly, it's different for different people according to their behaviors and other people's behaviors, but probably most platforms show us the things that lots of other people have engaged with. Yeah, that they liked, that they commented on, that they shared, yeah. And what's the best way to go viral, to get a lot of attention, is to say something crazy. Yeah, we've all sort of experienced some version of this, right? And this is probably because, if you believe the broader narrative, that this is also useful for keeping people engaged on a platform, and if you want to show them ads, then you should keep them engaged on the platform, right? But it's an example of how we lack of creativity in thinking about the future of social media. Because that's one business model, yeah, showing people ads, but there's also, for example, fear of missing out. So, this is another basic human instinct, right? We want to know what everybody else knows, and we want to enjoy what other people enjoy. So, what if instead of ranking information by how engaging it is to other people, which will then amplify the trolls, what if we boost the information that is positively engaged with by lots of different types of people? Something I call the bridging algorithm in my book. Okay, so the idea would be that then you begin to see lots of things that a lot of people agree with, right? That's good. We did a study. It seems that it decreased the spread of misinformation on Twitter by about 25% for a 3-week experiment. Pretty good. But even better, in the long term, if you are a troll on a platform that only rewards content that gets positive engagement across different groups, could be political groups, could be age groups, could be gender, could be whatever, right? All of a sudden, your tactics don't work, yeah? So you can't just fight the player, yeah? You have to change the playing field. That's my view. Yeah.
I have a question about this notion of incivility, and in particular, whether you could come up with situations where strong language is necessary, for instance, in order to drive certain social movements.
Yeah.
And so, what happens if, so I'm taking a very critical stance on it.
Yeah.
What happens if, on the long run, these interventions tone down discourse so much that they prevent some of these things to happen?
Yeah, it's a real concern. I think I should repeat the question only for the people who might be watching online. So the concern, I think, is about incivility is sometimes good, in a sense, in that it can catalyze a needed social movement. It's a really sharp question for a few reasons. If we go back to Nextdoor, this is the platform that we did the experiment with. You will see recent research by the Stanford linguist Dan Jarofsky and Jennifer Eberhardt, who's a social psychologist who has been studying racial discrimination for many years. Two really remarkable researchers in their own right. They did a study which suggests that Nextdoor's own toxicity monitor, at least for a time, seemed to penalize people who were using any language about Black Lives Matter. So if you talked about Black Lives Matter, you were marked as toxic. So it's not just a theoretical, it's happened in the real world, and I suspect it's happened on other platforms, just given the nature of how our machine learning pipelines worked at least 3 or 4 years ago. They're better now, presumably, hopefully, but it will happen. It is a really interesting question because civility is like a desirable norm. You know, like we could say, yes, it'd be nice to be nicer to each other. But I think you're right that there are times when we actually want to channel anger for productive, you know, especially in moments of great upheaval. And maybe, at least in the U.S., maybe we're in one of those. Yeah, and so I think you're right that we wouldn't always want to tone down and increase civility. It's really a question of when and where and how much. Yeah, I think. Yeah.
If I might add just a piece of, it might not be insecurity, it might simply be thinking out of the box.
Yeah.
All the algorithms take average. So, like Google Maps does, if you did a review that violates some kind of average, let's say, policies,
Yeah.
just because you put a picture that is a bit different or you put a comment that is a bit different.
Yes.
Although it's not something that could be labeled as civility, it's fun.
Yeah.
So the risk is simply banning thinking out of the box.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're right. The optimist in me thinks that certain kinds of models could be trained to help us discover those kinds of things. So, for example, I have a colleague at Duke, a brilliant computer scientist, and we've been talking about hallucinations a lot lately. Yeah, I think everybody's worried about delivering some kind of and maybe hallucinations in a Google review would be particularly concerning. Yeah. But if we change to a different conversation, like let's talk about science. So the end of my talk I was talking about can LLMs help us improve science, right? And we know, all of us are familiar with the remarkable magic of like AlphaFold and all the amazing ways that machine learning and hopefully to some extent generative AI will unlock new scientific findings. So this colleague has a brilliant idea. Maybe hallucinations are actually evidence of creative, unrealized combinations of human ideas. So you're right, these models are averages, right? They're taking the statistical average of human language. But that also means that they could potentially illuminate the space outside the proverbial spotlight that illuminates the research we do, yeah? So yes, I think you're right that there's the potential to trap us in boxes more. Absolutely, especially as the models, get tailored and personalized, and personalization is something I've got my eyes on, is very keen to see how this unfolds. But I think, in principle, they can also do the opposite. And so it's another call, I think, another reason for all of us to think about, in these early days, like what is the goal of the models, yeah? The problem with social media, in my view, we never thought smartly. We never even had a conversation about what social media ought to be. If I ask you, like, what is the point of Twitter? You're on Twitter. Anybody on Twitter? What's the point of Twitter? What's the point of Instagram? What's the point of TikTok? No? To laugh, maybe to laugh, maybe, but it's certainly not to learn, to connect with people, to engage in productive dialogue. Like, I guess we were connecting the world for a while and serving public conversation, but the platforms were never designed with those kinds of goals. And with AI, it's the same thing, right? AI is supposed to be all things to all people, right? Is that a good thing? I don't know. I think it's worth us all talking about, in a much more careful way. And if we learn a lesson from the social media era, it's that we probably have an opportunity to have a collective conversation about what these tools ought to be. And I worry we risk, going down the same road.
Maybe we have time for one last question. I have a question.
Yeah, please, yeah.
So I was wondering how much your results depend on the fact that the one person doesn't know the other is using AI. Because, for example, when I went for the first time to the supermarket in California or the UK, the cashier asks you, how are you? And at first you think, oh, how nice. But then you realize it's not real. They just ask because they have to, because the company says they have to.
Yeah,
So,
welcome to America.
Yes, so once you realize this, then you don't think it's nice anymore. So I was thinking, is the same happening here? Like, once you realize that the other person is just using AI, but probably they're just...
I'll give you a little color from the U.S. South. So in the U.S. South, the saying is, if anybody ever tells you bless your heart, they've told you they hate you. You have a performative kindness. Yeah, it's true. It's true. No, I think you're right. It's hard to. Who knows, right? I don't think we have any of the evidence we would need to know. And I can only respond to your question with another question, or another just provocation maybe, which is that so much of the research right now has very short horizons. Yeah. So we're looking at can generative AI help with one conversation at one point in time with two people, right? We're not studying what happens when someone used generative AI for 10 years. Well, haven't been 10 years yet. But you know what I mean? We're not even set up to do those studies. And so I think those long-term questions, like if we were to live in a world where we all had bot versions of ourselves that could argue for us on our behalf with other people's bots, is that a desirable world? You know, probably not, yeah? So I think these are the kinds of questions that it would take this long-term view to answer. And my concern is we're not rushing to develop the research designs that would help us answer your really fine question. Thanks. Yeah,
So let's thank Chris again for this